This is Roll Call for this edition of African Drums. The African drums are sounding.
Hi, good night and welcome to another episode of African Drums. As you know, African Drums is a presentation of the Cuffy 250 Committee. Tonight, we continue our conversation on important issues in the Guyanese community, particularly concerning African Guyanese people, and as is the aim and purpose of Cuffy 250, to ensure that the experience of the African Guyanese people are part of that national conversation on important issues. Tonight, our conversation focuses on education. In fact, the theme is Education Still Matters. Education has been a significant part of how we define our community. It has been a significant part of how African families see economic and social mobility and success. Tonight, I'm joined in studio by two members of the Cuffy 250 Committee, Ms. Charlene Wilkinson and Mr. Jonathon Adams. And we will be talking about education and why it still matters. I want to welcome our guests to the program. Welcome.
Good evening, Norwell.
Good evening, Ms. Wilkinson.
Good evening, Norwell.
And welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
I should say first off that for this month of April, the Cuffy 250 Committee will be focusing on that theme. The theme education is going to be a theme for all of our shows for this month. This first show, this 30-minute show, will be followed next week by another conversation related to education, and we will bring these two guests again at the end of the month to discuss another aspect of education in Guyana. I want to direct the first question to both of you. You're both members of the Cuffy 250 Committee. Education has been an important part of the focus of Cuffy 250 Committee. In fact, this was reaffirmed at a recent forum that Cuffy 250 hosted called the West Bank Forum on State of Our African Communities at the Bagotville Community Center. Why has education been such a major focus for Cuffy 250?
Well, Norwell, Charlene has been gracious in deferring to having me speak first, but education has traditionally been a means of social mobilization in the African community. But education serves a more general purpose. To me, education is that process by which people develop the technology and they transfer that technology to their succeeding generations to empower themselves to make a living from the economy around them, from the environment around them. And so you find that education would have a number of roles. One is to provide certification, the other one is to provide political mobilization, the other one would be to, within the Guyanese context, help foster social integration because of the social divisiveness, etc. So that education is not necessarily a prearranged or predestined thing. It is highly circumstantial. And so I pass the baton to Charlene.
Charlene, why has education been important?
Well, although it is highly circumstantial, it is a given for people to advance themselves, to perpetuate themselves, to carry on the memory of who they are and where they came from, without which we would not have the necessary cultural strength to carry on. For me, that's a very necessary and to me fundamental to all that you say. If it is not grounded in that fundamental sense of self, then it can be very frivolous and therefore vulnerable.
Education, though, has not been, and I think you alluded to this already, Jonathon, in your response, and both of you, education, though, has not been the only focus for Cuffy 250 Committee. Cuffy 250 has focused on economic activity is self-activity, as it's called. How then, and I know you alluded to it, how, in a more specific way, does education and the focus on education relate to other aspects of your work? I'm asking then if you can define that relationship to social cohesion, economic advancement, social advancement, and knowledge of self, as you said, Charlie. Let's start with you.
Well, I think that Coffee 250 is focused on the revitalization of the African community. And a part of that revitalization is an assessment of the role that education can play in the revitalization. And Coffee 250 is focused on specifically that aspect of education that Charlene spoke about, and that of helping people to understand where they came from, so that education becomes meaningful to them within a cultural context. See, the big problem in the Guyanese society is that Africans are culturally void. And so there's a need for that void to be filled, and Coffee 250 has made it a part of their central focus to educate. And then, after having educated, hope that the communities can now develop out of that education a sense of identity and a sense of economic direction, economic purpose. And so, education in Coffee 250 ought to spur economic development, identity formation, and social, actually, like you said, social cohesion in the African community, and understanding in the African community of that environment in which we operate.
So, in a sense, what it also becomes is a place, Coffee 250 becomes a kind of space that offers a way to help the Guyanese people out there deconstruct the inheritance, the colonial inheritance. You know, we are really who we are because of who our parents are and who our teachers are. That is, I mean, how can you, other than that, we are nothing. Our parents make us who we are, our teachers make us who we are. We, of course, come with our own individuality. And one of my greatest teachers is an African writer by the name of Aikwi Ama. And what he reminds us is that the oppression that African people experienced created a kind of psychological trauma that was so great that it was like an injury. And when you have a great injury, you're knocked unconscious so the body can protect itself. Because if you were awake when you had that injury, you would suffer so greatly you might not survive it. So he puts it to the colonial experience being us being put to sleep, in a sense that our true cultural identity is still unknown to us. I don't know if I'm making it clear, but it is so vividly clear when he explains it. So that the process of education for us is also at the same time the process of awakening. And that awakening has to be extremely gentle. I mean, think of the metaphor of waking a child up suddenly. You traumatize the child again. But if the awakening is very slow and gentle and systematic and compassionate, I think we are on the way to having a true education. And I know to a certain extent we, Jonathon and I, might sound rebellious and uncooperative at times with the system, but in fact we have to bring our people to a slow understanding of what is good for us in the system and what is destructive for us in the system.
In other words, Africans have been miseducated. And that education does not serve the purposes of equipping us to deal with the society. I deliberately decided that I would use, for the purposes of this discussion, the way in which African policemen treat African boys when they go into African
communities.
villages and African
That
communities.
is definitely one perfect example.
So Charlene, continue.
Yes. Yes, well, I was thinking something when you brought the idea of police up. The whole modus operandi of the school system, that we are in competition with each other. And then you have a whole assessment program that says who brings first and who brings second and who gets A, B, C, D. That has to be properly understood and criticized. There is essentially nothing wrong with competition. But if you're not competing to bring the best out in yourself, if you're competing with others to show that you are better than them, you have to understand, ask yourself, what does that really mean? Is that really a healthy approach to education? I don't know how you feel about that.
But when you started to talk about, you're talking about miseducation. Naturally, you're talking not only about formal education. You're talking also about education outside of the school system too.
Well, I think, Norwell, you're trying to protect the formal system, but that is precisely my thesis, that the formal system is miseducating us. It's miseducating us in that it is not preparing us to deal with the realities of our situation. Then it is miseducating us because it does not teach us about us. There is this very interesting fact.
So therefore, I just want to stick in. So is that and should that be a responsibility of the formal education system?
It is a responsibility of
And
the
it should
formal
be.
education system.
Okay.
It is also a responsibility of the informal education system. You see, there's a nexus, there's a relationship between the formal education system and the informal education system. The formal education system sets the agenda, sets the standards for what is acceptable in the general society. And so it has a responsibility for letting people understand, and especially Africans understand, that the first diversifiers of the economy were Africans, in the sense that after 1838, after emancipation, Africans moved away from the plantation, after apprenticeship, moved away from the plantations and established the villages. So they diversified the society politically and socially. And then when it came down to the 1880s, when sugar was in problems, the Africans diversified the economy. They moved from agriculture on the coast, went into the hinterland, and I was checking the figures today. They started an industry, the gold and diamond industry, which was exporting as much as $1 billion worth in gold and diamonds in the late 1800s, early 1900s. We don't have an education system which teaches us that. And so within that particular context, we are miseducated because by nature, the history of this nation has shown us to be the greatest entrepreneurs this nation has ever seen. And the most competitive group of people in this nation. All other nations have got tremendous help to be where they are. We worked against the odds. We worked with absolutely no state assistance, with the exception of in the Barnum era. And we have competed, and more than competed. So it is in that context that I say that the education system is a miseducation for us.
Charlene,
Well,
why was this miseducation necessary? Why those who, and we know who, but the designers of this education system, why did they see it necessary to ensure that the African person was miseducated?
well, it might not have been in that positive sense, but in a negative sense of ensuring the advancement of their own group. and that was the British colonists, okay? And for imperialism to survive, it had to create an education system that sanctioned and reinforced that hierarchy. It is really another kind of caste system, that there are certain elite few at the top, and then a middle rank of people who kept that elite few and justified their existence because they would get the crumbs from the table, and then the masses. That is one of the things I'm sure the average Guyanese is quite aware of. I think that what the average teacher in the classroom doesn't know and is in the process of learning, because Western education itself is now beginning to deconstruct itself and criticize itself. So we're moving from teacher-centered classrooms to child-centered classrooms, where people are being taught that the child is literally the most important person in the education process, and that sense of self is now becoming important all over the world. I mean, I have a very funny Dennis the Menace cartoon on my door at UG that says, the best thing you can become, the best thing you can do in life is get better and better at being you. So I'm switching from Jonathon's global sense of what we did as a group to talking about the individual classroom and the teacher and his or her job with the children, is to bring out that sense of self. How we do that now is to discuss what within the inherited system prevented us from doing that. And that is a very long story. It's not a story that we alone can tell. Many people can tell it. But it's an exciting story, actually.
Considering that, though, education or success in education has been almost a characteristic of the African Guyanese community. In my own family, we have spoken about education as a means to economic and social mobility and advancement. However, we have also witnessed declining educational achievement in African communities and among African students. How do you account for that? I'll start with you, Jonathon.
I think that what appears to be a declining level of achievement in the African community may not necessarily, it definitely does not mean that Africans have somehow or the other become less capable. I think that the society and the international imperatives have evolved in such a way as to make the traditional objective and role of education no longer applicable to the Africans. I go back to the report by the Reverend John Sterling in his recommendations to the British Parliament in 1835, where he recommended to the Parliament that the Emancipation Act, having guaranteed us our freedom, that it was the responsibility of education to mentally enslave us. That's not working with these youngsters.
Exactly.
Hey, diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle, the cow jump over the moon. Your babies come in airplanes. Now that's not working. Buju said full up of education but not have a payroll. So the young people are asking themselves, what's the sense? I'm absolutely certain that we have not done a scientific study of these to ascertain that these are ideally the responses or the reasons why our children are not doing well at education. But you can't tell a 5-year-old today that babies come in airplanes. And so you've got to have a completely new paradigm for that education system, which I firmly believe the young people are rejecting.
Yes.
Yeah, and particularly I think what's emerging, from my observation, is that increasingly this sense of immediacy, that you want to connect your education to things that are happening immediately, and you want to satisfy immediate needs also in your education. Education, however, Charlene, has been connected to in the community, the actual state of the community, the state of the family itself. I mean, we know of stories where if you can't afford to send a child to school, the child is not going to go to school. You know, if the child has to go to school hungry, you know, they can't focus in school. You know, so how do you see that dimension, the actual state of our community, in relation to education and education of the child?
I'm not sure I totally understand the question, but how do I see the state of...
Yeah, how does the state of the community, the state of the family, affect that child's ability to succeed in the education system? Is there a connection for us?
That's a very big question, because the state of families differ from family to family. And let's go back to the metaphor of being awakened. If you have an unawakened family whose parents, and in many cases whose single parent, simply puts that child to the education system thinking that teacher knows best, headmistress or headmaster knows best, and puts all her faith in that system, that I describe as one of the most unawakened families. I suspect that the most awakened family would be one that questions whether or not we should be sending our children to that system. And if we decide to do that, that we make up our minds to watch the system closely and find places in the society and maybe internationally which would allow us to criticize and understand what was happening in the system. You know, it is my hope that Coffee 250 becomes one such space for parents to come to get a better understanding. Go on, Jonathan.
When the Africans walked off of the plantation, one of the first things they developed was a school, and then a church, and then they developed the farmlands, etc., and living spaces. So that what you fundamentally had was a set of quote-unquote illiterate people understanding the need for education. So I do not understand the state of the society influencing the quest for education. And here is where I think that
not the quest. Maybe I should clarify. So what we're getting to is that the Coffee 250 committee is interested in self-activity, of which education is one component. And we've described, you have described in the earlier conversation, that outside of the system, the miseducation, the system itself, that education is also connected to economic and social issues.
Mm-hmm.
And we are talking here about declining performance. And we are saying that although there is the miseducation itself, which the system itself is problematic, also when a community is deprived of resources, when it is deprived of opportunities, and when social and economic infrastructure is weakened, how does that impact on achievement, if it in fact impacts on achievement?
But you see, Norwell, I think that we are making an assumption that deteriorating infrastructure, etc., necessarily leads to the underachievement of Africans in the educational system. All people did well when they studied with flambeau, when they had to go to school barefooted or barefeeted, whichever one is correct. My parents went to school barefooted, but they all achieved educationally. See, in this very same educational system, you've got Indians, for instance, winning 5 out of 8 CAPE or CXC awards for Guyana, and there is no African there. For me, it has very little to do with the physical infrastructure, etc. There is something going on in the African community in a cultural context, which, because of an education system which doesn't think that it is necessary to study why is it African children are not doing well, we don't have the answers. There is evidence to show that in worse societies we produced scholars. The question is, why in this so-called advanced age, and now that we have got more, why are we not producing the same way? I think there's a failure and I do not think that in a country where you've got one set of people obviously capable, not doing as well as others who are equally as capable, I do not think that there's a crisis in the educational system of that nation. I think there's a crisis in that community's understanding.
Yes,
And
I'd like to jump in too, because since we started this conversation, we haven't talked about what we mean by performance. From what I'm hearing, I'm reading between the lines, it seems as though performance means going and sitting at a desk with a whole set of other people in the room and writing an exam. If that is what you think of as performance,
And I'm glad you brought it in.
then you are
Yeah.
you're in a dinosaur age. Because
And students these days at CXC, you made the point about performance at CXC. I mean, if you do 20 subjects and get 18 ones, and I do 10 subjects and I get 10 ones, have I really performed poorly in comparison to your 18? I mean, the point is that I applied myself, my thinking, to the subjects. I think it shows critical thinking that you know the thing that you want to do.
Yeah,
And you
but-
apply yourself.
yeah, but you were
continue,
tested
sorry.
by sitting at a desk and putting
Yeah.
pen to paper.
Yeah.
Now, there was this very brilliant man called Howard Gardner who came up with a completely different understanding of children's intelligence. And he talks about multiple intelligences. And the linguistic intelligence to sit at this desk and write an exam is only one of 7. And he says maybe there are more than 7. There's mathematical, logical. You do that, you demonstrate that by sitting at the desk too. But there's spatial, there is kinesthetic, bodily intelligence. There is interpersonal intelligence, which Norwell demonstrates a great deal of because he does this kind of program. There's intrapersonal intelligence, where you understand yourself. We have not even begun to touch how to measure, I don't like the word measurement, but we have not even begun to touch how to see and to reveal these intelligences in our children. If you look at how the classrooms are shaped, in some schools they almost want to bolt the seats down to the ground. Where is the space in our schools to develop the arts and culture? Where is the space in our schools to develop sports in all our children? Where is the space to develop these multiple intelligences? So we have to talk about what we mean by performance. Not just assume it's passing CXC, passing common entrance, getting good at grade 2 and grade 9 assessment tests.
So then what is Coffee 250? Vision. What is the vision of Coffee 250? If you were to express it in just a few sentences, also in closing, because we're just about to the end of our half hour. What would you say is Coffee 250, considering all that we've talked about this evening?
I think that if one reflects on what Coffee 250 has been doing, I think that Coffee 250 has been attempting to define that performance in the widest context. Because in Essequibo, what has actually happened is that there has been developed this space where students can go after school and they can sit down and do their homework. But when Coffee 250 focuses on educating people in terms of their identity and educates them in terms of taking responsibility for their economic well-being, taking responsibility for helping to repair the damage that has been done to them, Coffee 250 is expanding that concept of education to the seven areas that Charlene just spoke about.
Charlie?
I mean, I hate to bring in a Jamaican example, but I know there are hundreds of thousands of Guyanese youth out there watching at what's happening to Vibes Cartel. And that they can educate us. That sort of they have the young people out there have a sense of have an interpersonal kind of intelligence that a lot of us older folks need to take a cue from them. So they're learning out there, they're teaching themselves out there, and they're using social media and they're getting on the internet and they're learning all sorts of other things. So I mean, we just really touched the tip of the iceberg here tonight.
The necessary tip.
Oh my! And I think it was a good way to start us this month. And I told you that the theme for this month is education. Education still matters. This has only been part one of what I know would be a very exciting month. Of course, these exciting guests will be with us at the end of the month when we sort of sum up all that we'll be talking about this month. This has been African Drums. This episode today focusing on education. Education still matters, the first in the month of April. Please continue to check us out on Facebook, the name Cuffy 250. Check us out on our YouTube channel with the same name, Cuffy 250, or drop us an email at coffee250gy@gmail.com. African Drums has been a presentation of the Coffee 250 Committee. I've been your host, Norwell Hinds. See you again next Sunday, same time.